Um, Good morning, my students. Hope you're doing well with your previous lectures and assignments. I'm doing. Please watch your lectures carefully and take notes because you need them in exam. As I said in the Facebook page, that our exam will be based on the information we deliver through these series of lectures. And today we're going to talk about translation methods, strategies, and techniques. There's so many. So these types of theories you want to have in your life career so you can apply, so you can be a professional translator and you can do well in your career. Okay? So just presenting an overview of translation methods, strategies, and techniques, in referring to the ways or modes adopted by translators in rendering text from one language into another لنقل النص من لغة إلى أخرى. Four terms are used: methods, strategies, techniques, and procedures اللي هي الإجراءات or procedure. For example, Vinny and Derplant 1995 used the term methods of translation as an umbrella term يعني كمظلة to refer to the ways or modes adopted by translators in transferring the meaning of a text from one language into another, which they call procedure. Newmark, one scholar, uses the term method in referring to the general approach or mode adopted by a translator in dealing with the ST or source target as a whole, but he uses the term procedure الإجراء يعني إجراء الترجمة for the way or mode of transferring the meaning of particular ST item. Newmark clearly states that while translation methods relate to whole texts, translation procedures are used for sentence and a smaller units of language. Okay, so some other scholars use the term strategy for both the general mode of text rendering, which they call macro strategy, okay, and for the transfer option performing on a specific ST item, which they call micro strategy. Bastin, in his book speaks of local strategy and global strategy, okay, and many more. So the above examples show that different scholars or writers use terms differently, dealing to different classifications, thus creating terminological confusion or overlapping. In other words, the same concept is expressed with different names and the classifications vary, covering different areas of translation problems. In one classification, one term may overlap another in a different system of classification. The category itself is given different names. A way out of this terminological confusion في هذا المخاض العلمي اللي كل واحد مسميه بشكل هو كله يصب في مخاض واحد بمعنى is to make terminological distinction that differentiates between the three key concepts, and that's to say translation methods, translation strategies, and translation techniques. So now in this lecture we're trying to clarify these three main concepts. Now let's get to understand what's a translation method. This is the generic umbrella or subordinate term referring to any mode of translation at any level of the ST. Okay? It's usually used collectively, that's the translation method, to refer to two types of translation method. macro level methods, translation strategies, that's to say translation strategies, and micro level methods, that's to say translation techniques. تقنية ترجمة كيف الآلية يعني. It's worth pointing out here that in practice some methods literal translation and adaptation التكيف والترجمة الحرفية من نقل are used at both macro and micro levels, that's to say translation strategies and translation techniques. And now we'll be looking at translation strategy, okay, as one type of translation methods. Generally, what is it? A strategy is a plan that's intended to achieve a particular purpose. In this context, it is a pre-translating plan adopted by the translator in dealing with the source or the ST as a whole at macro level. In other words, it's a global or holistic approach to the task. Translation strategy is the translator's overall game plan consisting of a set of strategic decisions taken after an initial reading of a source text. So you need to read it when you're doing a translation. First of all, you need to read the source text, and then you would start to do your plan to render that text into target text. Okay. But let's say, but before starting detailed translation of it, the pre-translation selection of translation strategy is an essential action towards achieving the desired reception and function of the translation in the target language. The selection of one translation strategy استراتيجية يعني آلية الترجمة another is either indicated by the translation brief or decided by the translator based on his analysis of the source text and assumptions about the translation audience and function. Based on a selected strategy, the translator will use the appropriate translation techniques that serve the translation strategy in achieving the translation's function. For example, if domestication is opted for as a strategy in translating a particular text, okay, borrowing as a translation technique will not be used, or if necessary, reduced to a minimum. The opposite will be true if the strategy is foreignization. Okay, and we'll look at these terms: borrowing, foreignization, and domestication. What are these terminologies in the coming slides? So that's the whole definition of translation strategy. Now we're moving into understand more of what is a translation technique. This is a transfer mode or procedure opted for by the translator in rendering micro level unit of a source text, a word, abbreviation, phrase, sentence, or feature, that's to say sound effect in a specific context. Translation techniques are used to deal with all challenges as they arise in a translation process. Thus, translation strategies are macro level oriented methods على المستوى يعني الصغير والمستوى الكبير macro والمicro. While translation techniques, okay, are micro level oriented methods. Examples of translation techniques are literal translation. These are examples of translation techniques. Literal translation, sometimes you need to do a literal translation word for word. Calc, later we will get to know what's calc. And borrowing, sometimes we need to do إعارة مفردات كما هي نترجمها. Transposition and modulation. The following is a diagram. Okay, this is a diagram translation. I'll send it to you. I'll try to take a picture of a diagram and send it to your Facebook page, hopefully. Translation techniques. So that's the whole things that we will be talking in details in the coming slides. Translation methods, translation strategy, and translation techniques. Okay. Now we move into common translation strategies. We get to know what are common translation strategies. As macro level methods are either source oriented or target oriented as follows. So اتجاه مصدري أو التارجت أو الهدف. So we start off with source oriented strategies. We get to know them how their strategies oriented towards the source text and the source text writer, source language or source language culture. The main purpose of these strategies is to return or reflect as much as possible the nature of its T, the style of the source text writer, the source language, method of expression, and or the flavor of the source language culture. These strategies include the following. So we will look into the source oriented strategies. We start with the literal translation. We get to know what the literal translation is, often confused with word for word translation, but it's more sophisticated than just replacing each source target word, source text word with the corresponding target text word as a strategy. Literal translation involves the production of a TT target text that reflects the content and features of those text as closely as possible. لما ننقل من لغة إلى أخرى نحاول أن ما نميعش النقل، لازم ننقله بحذافيره يعني بحيث أن تخرج ترجمة بروفيشنال مهنية أكثر ومبدعة. Okay. So it only deviates from this where necessary in order to produce a target text which is grammatically correct and intelligible. Typically, literal translation avoids any addition, commission, paraphrasing, or reductions. It's worth pointing out here that literal translation is used as a strategy and as a technique. So you can't drop anything. تنقل النص كما هو بدون زيادة أو نقصان، بس نص ذات معنى من اللغة الأم إلى من المصدر إلى الهدف. Now we move into semantic translation. Semantic translation is one of two translation strategies suggested by Newmark, a big scholar, big shot in the translation field. The other being communicative translation. Semantic translation involves the rendering معناها نقلة of the text or exact contextual meaning of the original text as closely as the semantic and syntactic structure of the target language allow. Semantic translation attempts to recreate the precise flavor and tone of the original. The words are sacred, not because they are more important than the content, but because the form and content are one. The thought processes in the words are as significant as the intention behind the words in a communicative translation. A semantic translation attempts to preserve its author, his idiolect, his peculiar form of expression in preference to the spirit of his source or target language. In other words, the translator's attempts within the bare syntactic and semantic constrained target language to reproduce the precise contextual النصية meaning of the author. إبت صفحة 22. As a strategy, semantic translation relates to expressive texts such as serious imaginative literature, authoritative statements, autobiographies, and personal correspondence or correspondence. So that's what the semantic translation is. الدلالة الترجمة الدلالية والمعنوية. Now we move into our third type of common types of source-oriented strategies, and that is Avert Translation. This is one of the Two translation strategies or types identified by House. 2015, page 54, a Scala House name. The other being Covert Translation, Avert Translation. Refers to the strategy on the basis of which the target text does not have the status of a second original but of an unconcealed avert translation because the target text is not specifically directed to the TT audience, target text audience, المستمعين أو القراء. So in House, an overt translation is one in which the addressees اللي هم اللي ننقل لهم الكلام of the translation are quite overtly, not directly addressed. In overt translation, the original is tied in a specific manner to the source language, community, and its culture, and is often directed at source culture addressees, but at the same time of potential general human interest. House 2015 text calling for overt translation or either those associated with historical occasions such as sermons and political speeches delivered by prominent figures or timeless texts such as works of art and aesthetic creation. So that's the whole about overt translation. How about documentary translation? Who can tell us what's a documentary translation? توثيقية ترجمة is one strategy or type of translation identified by Nord في 88 سنة 88. The other being instrumental translation. Documentary translation serves as a document of a source culture communication between the author and a source text receiver. In a documentary translation, particular as aspects or the whole source text situation are reproduced for the target text receivers. A documentary translation may focus on any of the features on each rank of the ST, such as a word-for-word translation, which focuses on a morphological, صرفية, lexical, دلالية, and syntactic structure, نحوية. The result of a documentary translation process, the text, whose main function is metalinguistic. The target text, in this case, is a text or about one or more particular aspect of a text. So now we turn into our last step or strategy of a source-oriented, and that's what they call it as foreignization. What is it? Borrowed from a German theologian and philosopher, Friedrich. The terms foreignization and domestication are identified as two strategies in translating literary and philosophical works in the Anglo-American world. تترجم يعني النصوص الأدبية والفلسفية في Anglo-American world. As a strategy for foreignization, which may involve lexical and syntactic borrowings. أوقات نستعير في كلمات وتركيب دلالية, and calques reflects. Later we'll get to know what calque is. The SL source language or source language norms and reminds the target culture readers that they are dealing with a translation, thus in some ways bringing them closer to the experience of a foreign text. According to Vinet, foreignizing translation signifies the differences of a foreign text.
It's 11 o'clock.
Only by disrupting the cultural codes that prevail in a translating language. The result of foreignizing translation is a text which deliberately breaks target language culture conventions by retaining something of the foreignness of the original. So that's what all about the source-oriented strategies. Okay, so now let's look at several types of target-oriented strategies. You know, these strategies are oriented towards the target text audience in a target language socio-cultural context. Their focus is to produce a target text that conveys the source text message or achieves its purpose without necessarily retaining the same source text structural and stylistic features اللي هم الأسلوبية يعني سمات الأسلوبية. These strategies include the following. There's so many, but I've chosen just the most like appropriate things for you. Okay, there's several actually. So we start off with free translation, as you see it on your slide. What is it? What's a free? I think I talked about free translation in the first 2 or 3 lectures, and this is kind of we do it again. It's usually used in contrast with literal translation. So yeah, we talked about literal translation in the previous slide. And what is it? It's a strategy which is more concerned with creating a target text that sounds natural in the target language than with conforming to source text elements and structure. This definition according to Mundi in his 2009. In other words, في كلمات أخرى خلينا نعرف الترجمة الحرة. Free translation is usually taken to concentrate on conveying the meaning يعني لترسل المعنى of the source target ST يرمزوا لها بالST معناها source text اللي هو نص المصدر اللغة اللي تنقل منها إلى disregarding the formal or structural aspects of the source text. Okay, so that's one type of target-oriented strategies. So when you do translate, you might sometimes use one strategy or another, and the most you feel you're comfy with. Now we turn into communicative translation, and what is it? According to Newmark, a scholar in the translation field, communicative translation attempts to produce on its readers an effect as close as possible to the obtained on the readers of the original. In other words, في كلمات أخرى للتسهيل, the emphasis will be on conveying the message of the source text in a form which conforms to the TL linguistic, cultural, and pragmatic conventions rather than mirroring the ST, and will smooth over an irregularities of style, remove ambiguities, and even correct the source text author's factual errors. Sometimes you may find some problems in the source text, and you as a professional translator, you would do your best to render it in the best form, okay? Which with the aim of making the TT, the target text, achieve the intended communicative function in the target language. So, as a strategy, communicative translation is used in translating informative and operative text types. Okay, so this is the second type of target-oriented strategies. And now we look at what's called in previous slide. We look at avert translation, or maybe in the next slide we look at the overt. And today in this slide it's called covert translation. Let's say what is covert translation? According to House, one scholar, this is the translation strategy that leads to target text which enjoys the status of an original source text in the target culture. It's covert because it's not marked pragmatically as a translation of its estate, but may have been created in its own right. The source text of a covert translation is not specifically addressed to a particular source, culture,
audience, or in other words, it's not particularly tied to a source language and culture. The source text and its covert translation are pragmatically of equal concern for source and target language addressees اللي هم المخاطبين. They were equally directly addressed. The ST and its covert translation have equivalent purpose as they are based on contemporary equivalent needs of comparable audience in both the source language and the target language communities. So as a strategy, covert translation is used in translating scientific, علمية, economic, اقتصادية and journalistic صحفية text النصوص هذه, as well as tourist materials. Tourist materials اللي هو الأدوات السياحية. Okay. So this is all about what's called covert translation. So now we turn to our upcoming type, and that's instrumental translation. So we get to know what's instrumental translation more. According to Nord 1988 2005 page, you find it in 81 if you're looking at the source. This is a translation strategy to produce a target text that functions independently from the source text in the target culture. يعني الثقافة الهدف يعني اللغة اللي ننقل إليها يجب مراعاتها باهي. With an instrumental translation, the target text is usually read by receivers as though it were an original ST, fulfilling a communicative purpose in a target culture without the readers being aware that it was originally written in another language for another communicative situation. Typical examples are technical texts, تقنية, where the function is preserved in a target language. So that's the instrumental translation. And now we turn to study or get to know what domestication as a strategy in a target-oriented. It's a translation strategy identified by Venet, a scholar's name is Venetti, as opposed to foreignization, يعني بمقابل جد تناهض التغريب foreignization. domestication اللي هي عكس التغريب، المواطنة أو حاجة زي كده. Involves an ethnocentric reduction of the foreign text to receiving cultural values, bringing the author back home. In other words, as a translation strategy, domestication entails translating in a transparent way capable of giving access to the author's precise meaning and to minimize the strangeness of the foreign text for the target language readers. And we move now into our last strategy in this slide. As I told you, there's so many, but we chose just a number of them. And that's adaptation, التكيف الشيء يعني نحاول أن ندير له modification is a motivated intervention by translators to re-rent a source text in terms of a context and function. المحتوى هو الوظيفة. In other words, adaptation constitutes تركب أو تكون a general strategy which aims to reconstruct the purpose, function, or impact of the source. The intervention of a translator is systematic, ممنهج, and he or she may sacrifice formal elements and even semantic meaning in order to reproduce the function of the original. As a general strategy, adaptation is associated with particular contexts or genres such as theatrical translation, audio-visual translation, advertising, and children's literature. These are characterized by a high degree of interplay between linguistic text and other aspects such as image and sound. So that's how adaptation is achieved, and that's the most common target-oriented strategies we should be aware of. For more details, try to look up in your internet for the different types of target-oriented strategies, or visit some scholars' text, and among of these texts is the textbook is written by Professor Jamal Jabir. The title of a book that we're studying in this lecture is Translation, Theory, Methodology and Practice. ترجمة النظرية methodology الطريقة والتدريب. Thank you, and let's move into another slide. Okay, now we move into our last slide, and that's translation techniques. What is it, and what are its types? Translation techniques. The following are common translation techniques used by translators in different contexts and for different purposes. The first three are modes of direct translation, while the remaining techniques are modes of oblique translation. يعني the Dictome of direct versus oblique translation method was introduced by Tarplint and Vina and was later taken up by some writers such as Byron, who explains the Dictome as for direct translation of what was a relatively straightforward technique, which required less intervention by the translator and less deviation from a source text, though relatively unsophisticated form from a linguistic point of view. Direct translation techniques such as literal translation, borrowing, calquing are useful in a range of scenarios. So now let's start off with the literal translation as a technique. Literal translation is the rendering of some source text units such as morphemes الأجزاء الصغيرة من الكلمة, words, phrases, and sentences by contextually equivalent target language morphemes, words, phrases, and sentences. That's a literal. According to Nomwork, this technique is a verb translation and must not be avoided if it skews referential and pragmatic equivalence. Literal translation as a technique is usually used to serve ST-oriented translation strategies such as semantic translation, Avert Translation, literal translation, and documentary translation, the one we just talked about. The following is an extract from Hemingway's novel, The Old Man and the Sea, and literal translation of its contextual units into Arabic by Munir Balabki. So let me read it to you. When a boy came back, the old man was asleep in a chair, and the sun was down. The boy took the old army blanket off the bed and spread it over the back of the chair and over the old man's shoulders. Hemingway, 1952, page 10. Let's look at the translation of it by, as I mentioned here, and that is حين رجع الفتى كان الشيخ نائما في الكرسي وكانت الشمس قد غربت ورفع الفتى البطانية العسكرية العتيقة عن السرير ونشرها على ظهر الكرسي وفوق كتفي الرجل العجوز. Hemingway, page 17. So that's the literal translation الأدبية, الترجمة الأدبية. And now we look into calque translation. This is a translation technique to borrow the concept of a source language word or phrase through the literal translation of its constituent parts with the aim of creating a target language word or phrase to fill a lexical conceptual gap in the target language. Thus, calque refers to the deliberate choice, not the unconscious influence and undesired interference. So again, we have another definition. The result is either a lexical calque, that's to say a calque which represents the syntactic structure of the target language, whilst introducing a new mode of expression, or a structural calc, which introduces a new construction into language. Following Pyron, sometimes it's necessary to introduce new expressions, neologisms in a target language, but it's advisable to introduce them without a good reason, especially where there are acceptable alternatives in the target language. The following are examples of common English Arabic lexical calcs. So these, let's hear me out. The examples that's considered calc: غسيل الأموال مثلا مقابلها money laundering، بلاش غسيل الأموال. إعادة التدوير recycling. هواتف ذكية سمارت فونز. مرات نقول لكم أعطوني مثال من الكالك تجيبوا لي منهم عادي في الامتحان. مثلا حقائب صديقة للبيئة environmental or environment friendly bags. البيت الأبيض white house. القوة الناعمة soft power. كرة الثلج snow ball. وجبة سريعة fast meal. يقتل الوقت kill time. مقهى انترنت كافيه. نيران صديقة friendly fire. حكومة الظل shadow cabinet. يلعب دورا play a role. So English Arabic structural calcs are phrases such as من قبل and من جانب, which reflect English by structure, as in the following two examples. Conversion actions are used by automata to convert between types of content. إجراءات التحويل تستخدم من قبل، هذا يسمى في calc في اللغة العربية. Automator للتحويل بين أنواع المحتوى, and so on. So now we turn to our other type of translation techniques, and that's borrowing. Sometimes we borrow words from the origin into target language as they are actually. So let's look at the definition of borrowing. Borrowing is the technique of taking a word or expression straight from the source text and using it in the target text with or without a change in the phonological and or morphological structure. So the purpose of borrowing is to fill a lexical gap. تملى فراغ، يعني مرات ما عنديش في اللغة القابلة نفس الكلمة in a target language, or to convey a special source language effect. ومرات نبي نرفع التأثير نفسه اللي هو واقع في التارجت في السورس لانجوج، اللغة اللي ننقل منها. وأمثلة كثيرة مثلا زي الإنترنت، نقول إنترنت. يونسكو، منظمة اليونسكو، United Nations، وهكذا. يونسكو نقول عليها. نرجع من الفاكس نقول فاكس. كريكت، لعبة الكريكت، والجولف نقول عليها كريكت وجولف. بنتاغون نقول بنتاغون. تكنولوجي نقول تكنولوجيا. أجندة نقول أجندة، ما نقولش سلسلة. استراتيجي نقول استراتيجية. The example of Arabic words borrowed by English are الزكاة مثلا، حجاب، انتفاضة يقولوا انتفاضة، شيخ وهكذا. سلطان، جمل، كمل مثلا. صحراء، صحارى يقولوا. So that's the different types of borrowing in translation techniques. Okay. Before let's move. There are actually so many different other translation techniques, but I chose a number of them. And now we look into the description. Sometimes we need to do description. This is a technique of replacing a source text expression with a description of its meaning and all function in the target target text. Sometimes we don't translate, we just do a description of it. It's used when a translator fails to find or create the target language equivalent. Sometimes we can't find the equivalent، المقابل لها, that achieves the contextual meaning اللي يصل إلى المعنى النصي of the source language term. So generally descriptive translation equivalents are lengthy formations. In the following example, the term subtitling.
2 o'clock.
Subtitling in the English is translated by a descriptive phrase in the Arabic translation. For instance, an affiliated problem of translation for the cinema, whether dubbing or subtitling, شوفوا الترجمة. والمشكلات المتصلة بالترجمة سينمائية، سواء فيما يتعلق بالدبلجة اللي هي dubbing أو الترجمة المطبوعة على الفيلم. شوف السبتايتلينج ما عنديش بدل جبتها بطريقة. So that's another example of the description is the translation of a term retool in the English source text by a descriptive phrase in the Arabic. Retool means an interpretation where the interpreter is working into an achieved language, an active language, other than the mother tongue. So الترجمة إلى غير اللغة الأم. تعالى ريتور الترجمة إلى غير اللغة الأم. ترجمة فورية حيث يترجم المترجم فيها إلى لغة نشطة غير لغته الأم. So that's how the description is. Sometimes we need to describe the matter or the subject matter. Okay. Now let's see modulation before we move into paraphrasing and finish our lecture. This is a technique of changing the form of information by presenting it from a different point of view. So we do some modulation. تكييف ونلف عليها يعني. It is useful where a written translation would be anidiomatic. Some modulations are compulsory or mandatory مهمة, usually because of structural difference between a source language and a target language, while others are free or optional. So some scholars identify a number of types of modulation, including the following. For instance, replacing a negative with a positive. خلينا نشوفها. Don't take this medicine before meal. شوفوا التارجت text. تناول هذا الدواء بعد الطعام. من negative إلى إيجاب. This door shouldn't be left open at any time. أغلق هذا الباب في كل الأوقات. So that's a modulation. The idea was unclear. كانت الفكرة غامضة. Another type is called replacing a double negative with a positive. لم تكن المشكلة غير قابلة للحل. The problem was solvable. Replacing a positive with a negative. Another type. The report was subjective. كان التقرير غير موضوعي. And so on. Use of part for whole or whole for part. That's one type. And what is it? عدت إلى أهلي يا سادتي بعد غيبة طويلة 7 أعوام على وجه التحديد. كنت خلالها أتعلم في أوروبا. It was, gentlemen, after a long absence, 7 years to be exact, during which time I was studying in Europe, that I returned to my people. So you see how my people is sort of modulation and so on. That's modulation. So now there are different other types like expansion and restructuring, generalization, particularization, adaptation. But we will have a talk about our last step in the translation technique, and that's paraphrasing. This is a technique of using more words in a target text than were presented in the source text in order to re-express an idea or reinforce the sense of a source text word or phrase whose correspondence in the target language can't be expressed as concisely as in the source language. This technique is also called amplification. Paraphrases used in translating special source text units such as terms which designate cultural specific concepts or highly complex technical or scientific concepts depending on the target text type and readership. A source text abbreviation, for example, may need to be rendered with the help of a paraphrase explaining what it is. The following are English-Arabic and Arabic-English example. Like, pragmatics is a new branch of modern linguistics. علم دراسة استخدام اللغة. شفتها كيف درنا paraphrasing. فرع جديد من فروع اللغة. late afternoon prayer صلاة العصر. late afternoon prayer. SMS خدمة الرسائل القصيرة. So here we did the paraphrasing. Instead of saying SMS, we just translated it. The main effect between paraphrasing and description is that the former is an explanatory phrase while the later produces a descriptive one. So at this point we finish introducing the translation techniques. Thank you for your listening. Work hard, work smart, get well prepared for your exams. We may let our last lecture either posted here on your system, university system, or we do it as practical in a group where you need to translate texts from Arabic into English and English into Arabic. Thank you.